All right, welcome everybody, and thank you for being here for the Friends of the Cabildo 2025 Spring Lecture Series. I hope you're excited for, I think, 10 lectures all the way into June. And then we have a couple classes in there, mixed in there as well, that I would recommend you take advantage of as well. But tonight we're going to kick off the series with a 3-week talk that's going to have some themes that are going to run through some different areas. And we're going to be, let's see, where am I? The link there. Um, we're going to be talking about tonight slavery in the suburbs, slavery in real estate in the Faubourgs of New Orleans. And our speaker tonight is Greg Beaman. Greg is an adjunct lecturer at Georgetown University, lives up in DC, but his area of focus is New Orleans history. And he's going to be talking to us for the next 3 nights. And I want to welcome Greg. And we're excited to have you tonight and to have you next 2 Tuesdays.
Thanks very much, Jason. I appreciate that. All right, well, it's a real honor to speak before the Friends of the Cabildo tonight, so thank you all for coming in. This is a historic group in its own right. Jason and I were just talking about some of the great oral history work that they've done over the years, and it's just the tip of the iceberg. So I'm really happy to be here. The research I'm presenting tonight is from my dissertation that I'm currently revising into a book manuscript. And so I'll just go ahead and get started. I'm going to share some slides here and zoom in on some things and try to take us on a chronological journey of development of the Faubourgs of New Orleans. A major disaster devastated New Orleans on March 21st, 1788. The Great Fire of that year was a tragedy for hundreds and hundreds of people, free and enslaved. As the wind blew the smoke downriver, many of those escaping the flames fled upriver to the property of Maria Josepha Delon and her husband Beltran Gravier, who owned the plantation closest to the city on the upriver side in today's CBD. As Beltran Gravier would later testify, on the day of the fire, I sent all of the slaves from my habitation who defended and helped many houses and freed them from the flames after mine, and they cared for the families that I kept for a few days in my house. Now, with people camping out on his front lawn, Gravier decided to make money. Right after the fire, Julian Poydras of Poydras Street went immediately in pursuit of Mr. Gravier in order to prevail upon him to change his estate into a suburb. An early disaster capitalist, Gravier took steps to build a suburb, secured a major enslaved labor force, and pocketed his first profits less than a month after the fire. I'm talking tonight about the relationship between real estate and slavery from this moment on, when the Graviers began developing the first Faubourg, Faubourg Sainte-Marie, until just after the Civil War and the abolition of slavery. The actions Gravier and Delon took after the fire to develop this first Faubourg set a pattern for later developers. To me, the Faubourgs were a kind of frontier of capitalism and urban development. And looking at them in this way gives us a great opportunity to watch people as they're working out the boundary lines of these newly developing lands. Many people, many diverse individuals saw visions of themselves in the Faubourgs: enslaved, free, rich, poor, American, Creole, Afro-Creole, immigrant, German, Irish, Italian, and others took financial, political, and power-defying risks to realize those visions. Now, New Orleanians viewed urban development, like everything else in a slave society, through the lens of slavery. And so I call these dueling visions the pro-slavery and the anti-slavery spatial imaginations. These imaginations were made real in the built environment as new suburbs that became sites of close interactions between free and enslaved people across cultural and linguistic barriers. In most of the records I use for my research, slavery is a given because they're business records. They're records of the economy, and the economy rested on slavery. But I also find inklings and other places of resistance that is usually left out of the story of urban development. And one thing this project does is it tells the history of how New Orleanians managed this relationship between slavery and real estate in the Faubourgs. I look at how the law strengthened the slave system to enrich capitalists and keep the money flowing through the city. But I also look through the lens of African American history to see how free and enslaved people manipulated the law and social customs to resist racial domination and create their own paths throughout the city and the suburbs. During the late 18th century, sugar and cotton started to take their hold on the Deep South. Planters wanted more land for more profits, greater control. And so the planters and their heirs who owned the plantations closest to the city, Marigny, Tremé, Gravier, and so on throughout the years, started selling their property to real estate developers. At the beginning of this era, enslaved Africans were the predominant labor pool. The free people of color, the libres of the Spanish era, dominated the trades. By the American period, though, urban development in New Orleans led the United States into an era of national internal improvements. The city built a municipal waterworks, paved streets, and invested in port infrastructure. Over time, driven by financial constraints, sensitive to nativism and immigration and anti-Blackness, officials added white immigrant laborers to the previously slave-based labor crews. So this is also a story about immigrants coming to the United States, to New Orleans, from Europe, South America, and Asia, who ended up having their own say over slavery, labor, and the shape of the city. And ultimately, building the city cost labor and lives, a greater price than has yet been recognized. And I'll start with a little bit of the Gravier family's history in the slave trade. The month after the Great Fire of 1788 changed the course of New Orleans history and set a pattern of urban development linked inseparably to slavery. By April 1st, 1788, just 11 days after fire had destroyed 80% of the old city, the Graviers invited the royal surveyor, Carlos Lavaux Trudeau, to measure their property and place stakes at the corners of several lots closest to the river. Then, on April 13th, 12 days later, Gravier purchased 60 enslaved people, 52 men and 8 women from Pedro Sauvé. And on April 19th, Julian Poydras paid 1,167 pesos for the first lot, here at the corner of Poydras and Tchoupitoulas streets. These were the earliest suburbs of New Orleans. And during the colonial era, the city was just the Vieux Carré, surrounded by these fortifications that were built late in the French period and expanded majorly during the 1780s and 1790s. And the decisions that Beltran Gravier and Maria Josepha Delon made regarding the development of this new suburb came as they weighed equally pressing questions related to their investments in the Atlantic slave trade. Gravier's involvement in the trade began as early as 1786. For a time, he and a man named Juan Dupuy held a royal license to import slaves. Gravier and Dupuy owned the sloop El Favorito as it traveled to Kingston, Jamaica, under the command of Juan Larmandi between 1788 and 1790. Slaving was a family affair for the Graviers. Nicholas Gravier, Beltran's nephew, even sailed himself to purchase enslaved cargoes from the African coast. Juan Gravier, their cousin, handled the business posts upriver. And to see this connection, Nicholas Gravier, as it was later testified, it was public and well known that Nicholas was involved in all of Beltran's business, especially in the number of sales of lots in the Barrio Santa Maria outside the city walls. It wasn't just the market, though. The long history of the Gravier plantation as slave space also profoundly influenced the physical development of Barrio Santa Maria and the terminology people used to describe the new neighborhood. This slide is a copy of the map that Trudeau laid out in 1788. And if we zoom in here, you see Rue de Camp, Camp Street, and right over here over Poydras Street, surrounded by 4 M's, is the Campo de Negres, the slave camp. Now, this camp wasn't where the workers on the Gravier plantation lived, but the site where he kept his newly arrived enslaved cargoes, who he marketed and sold to investors in the new suburbs. We see over here the series of buildings. Building A here is the main house where Gravier and his wife lived, and B here is the lodgings for the workers and the domestics. So not only the men and women who labored inside the house, but also the field hands and those who had more specialized skills. And some of those who had more specialized skills worked here in this building labeled H, which is labeled the Grand Magazine for Rice and Straw, right there on Rue du Magazine, Magazine Street. So it wasn't the powder magazine that was somewhere here inside the city walls that exploded famously during the 1794 fire that named Magazine Street. Belcher and Gravier named Magazine Street after the warehouse where his enslaved workers had their workshop. Now, Faubourg Sainte-Marie quickly became a crossroads for travelers from all directions, especially the flatboatmen from Kentucky, Indiana, and Ohio, the famed cane-toxin Hoosiers. Escaped slaves, marronage, were also a problem for authorities in Spanish Louisiana, and so concerns about slave mobility factored into the new official policies that went into governing these new faubourgs. In order to solve this problem, the authorities made new bureaucracies and strengthened their old ones. For one, colonial soldiers patrolled the walls outside the city. This is a separate map of the faubourg. Orleanians here with the city walls again. Here are the sold lots. Here are in pink the sold lots. The yellow lots are ones that are still being offered for sale. We have the fields, indigo and sugar, B and D. And then we have the city commons over here in green. But then back here at F, I'll zoom in, we have some felled timber and we have a tree line. And if you look at the Louisiana Colonial Documents collection that the State Museum's made available online, you'll see scores and scores of stories about things, criminal acts happening along this tree line. And so this is a great way to see the relationship between slavery and these newly developing faubourgs. Now, New Orleans grew in part during these years because of Atlantic commodities, sugar and cotton and many others that flowed through the city and on to global ports. To me, the establishment of local markets for these commodities signifies a major milestone in the urbanization process. But as commodity production moved further away from urban New Orleans, the city and its suburbs grew into their role as the crossroads of the Atlantic world. There's one well-known book many years ago labeled it. This shipping to New Orleans created what I like to call the refuse of capital, excess materials that were discarded from Atlantic circulations and diverted into local uses. Now, we all know capitalism's an extractive process. It bleeds objects and places and people of their market value, and then capital digests those objects, places, and people. Then this digested refuse of capital becomes the next big thing, whether it's liquor, lumber, or liquidity on the financial markets. Now, in New Orleans, anyone who's followed historical preservationists knows that adaptive reuse is a policy goal, a very good one. We hope not to demolish old buildings or send materials to the landfill. We want to use buildings, old buildings and materials in new ways. And this is what the city did. And this is the refuse of capital. For instance, the land itself. The city sought to prevent bad actors from diverting the refuse of capitalism to illegal ends, so they didn't allow these vacant plantation lands to remain vacant long. The flatboatmen and the inhabitants, when they landed on the Batcher, they discarded the boards of their flatboat, and they built buildings and social gathering places using what's called barge board. I think we've all heard of barge board. But also city officials enticed ship captains to sell their ballast to the mayor to pave the streets and erect curbstones. So stones from all over the world built the streets of the Vieux Carré and the new faubourgs. Now, this spirit reached into commodity production too, because distilleries sprouted up in the faubourgs, like the Fort and Clement distillery in Faubourg de la Course between Richard Street and Market Street. This market's not there anymore, of course. And the Gildive in Bourg Clouet down in the Bywater. This is between Louisa and Clouet Streets, right on the river. These distilleries took up the used up sugar cane that had already been pressed, called bagasse, and used it to make rum, tafia, gin, and aguardiente. The spirit of the refuse of capital really suffused development. Now, let's take a closer look at the development of a plantation into a Faubourg on a physical level. Whereas the homes of the planters often became part of the suburban landscape, the homes of the enslaved slowly disappeared. This is an elevation of the Jean-Baptiste Marigny plantation house between Race and Euterpe streets and the lower garden district, what was Faubourg Delacourse. And here's a survey plan of that. Zoom in, we have Annunciation Square over here on the left. This is where the Soleil apartment buildings are now. This is, I think, one of the parking garages. There's a big vacant lot over here where people park. But you can see the plantation buildings are integrated into the cityscape, the new Faubourgs street grid. But not all the buildings were. In Faubourg de Lourdes, we can see, this is kind of blurry, I'm sorry about that. One of these plantation buildings is laying right in the middle of Annunciation Street. But to be more detailed, we'll go into detail here for Faubourg Delacourse. This is the plan of the habitation of the deceased Jean-Baptiste Marigny from Historic New Orleans collection. There's the river on the left. If we zoom in here, we can see that same house we saw a minute ago, slave cabins on the right, a brickyard, plantation, indigo processing. This low-lying area here is Coliseum Square today, pretty much the exact same shape. That's why Coliseum Square was the sewer of the Faubourg Delacourse. Some cultivated land, rice paddies, and then the cypress swamp all the way back to Norman Francis Parkway. Here's that map that I've geo-referenced and overlaid onto the current street grid to see the extent of it from the river all the way to Norman Francis. I'm going to flip orientation here. Here's a zoom in of the house and the gardens. Here we are, overlaid once again on the current street grid of Chapatula Street along the front of the gardens, Race Street right down the middle, Annunciation Square. There are those slave cabins again that are laying right over the street grid. Now, these streets were opened up eventually, but the homes of the enslaved people were demolished and the enslaved people were dispersed, some to other plantations, some older people were emancipated, some folks were sold to buyers in the Faubourgs and actually remained present in the new neighborhoods as they developed. And in my bigger project, I go into quite a bit of detail about that. But another way that slavery impacted the built environment was through local and transatlantic credit that financed real estate development. Armand Duplantier, the Baton Rouge planter who bought the suburb de Lourdes, he extended his credit all the way by begging credit for from his relatives in France. At the same time, he was engaged in large-scale slave trading. But on a smaller scale, owners of individual lots, builders and contractors mortgaged and remortgaged slaves to finance the construction of the suburbs and of their own homes. Victoire Martineau hired a builder, and she sold a woman named Cydalise and her daughter to the builders, Jean-Baptiste Nourrice and Henri Amelung, for $400, and then paid $222 on top of that for bricks that Amelung and Nourrice had actually acquired to build sidewalks in the Faubourg Saint-Marie. These bricks, though, destined for a suburban sidewalk, were diverted as payment in a slave sale and went on to finance the building of the cottage. So, ways great and small that slavery influenced urban development. Now, slavery, for all its benefits to real estate developers, was a problem as well. The inequities and the inequalities of the system were a major argument against slavery. And this is one place where we're going to start to see the anti-slavery spatial imagination start to make headway against the pro-slavery spatial imagination. It's something as simple as a lease dispute. In many court cases, we see lease disputes going back and forth with enslaved messengers taking the messengers back and forth. But tenants also financed their rent by leveraging enslaved servants. William Reagan and his wife, Mary Boyd, mortgaged a woman named Susan to secure a lease on a house, Chapatula Street in the Faubourg St. Mary. Now, they earned just enough money to buy one woman to do their cooking and cleaning, and then used her as collateral to borrow money just to pay their rent. So this was sort of a damage deposit. And it really gets in the minute ways that enslaved people were abused in the system to financialize and support this capitalist real estate development. Because, face it, owning real estate is an investment. It can mean financial security for yourself or a building block to generational wealth for your descendants. Now, these stories of disputed titles, landlord-tenant suits, and the wavering rights of people of African descent in the real estate market demonstrates also the insecurity of investment in early American New Orleans for all people of middling and lower means. The systems really weighted toward the top. And while the law seemed to give free people of color equal economic rights, in practice, their social and political subordination placed them at risk of injustice in courts. So while enslaved people had the right, of course, with an enslaver's permission to maintain plots of land to grow crops for personal use and selling at market, they had no right to own real estate because they couldn't sign notarial acts or sign contracts. But through relationships with free people, through family, kinship, or other social connections, enslaved people had a stake in the real estate market. And many stories like this really made it real for me that this stake could carry on into freedom. I'm going to tell a story about Charlot and Fanny and the family of Nicholas Noel d'Estrahan. Now, Charlot was an enslaved man who bought his freedom from the d'Estrahans in the 1820s, and then bought the usufruct of a lot in the Faubourg Franklin from his former owner, Nicholas Noel d'Estrahan. Now, Faubourg Franklin, St. Roch today, got Elysian Fields over here on the left, labeled Champs-Élysées and Avenue des Bons Enfants, Good Children's Street, St. Claude Avenue. But this house right here, I've identified as Charlot's lot, and probably the house that he built. At the time that he bought this property, the usufruct of it to work it, Charlot's wife Fanny was still enslaved by the d'Estrahans and worked in their sugar fields, a slave for life, as the records claim. But after working for a year to improve this lot, Charlot sold the usufruct back to Nicholas Noel d'Estrahan for a profit, and then used that money to purchase the freedom of Fanny. So Fanny definitely had a stake in the real estate market through Charlot. I get into some micro histories as well. When I lived in New Orleans, between about 2005 and 2015, I did a lot of house history research. My company was called Our House Stories. Perhaps you remember it. But I tell the history of this house on Elysian Fields Avenue that belonged to M.A. Guillet, who was the state collector of taxes on real estate and slaves. An enslaved woman named Delphine lived here. And Delphine filed a freedom suit against Guillet's widow after his death. Delphine was most likely Guillet's daughter with Mimi, another woman who Guillet enslaved. And in Delphine's freedom suit, the testimony turned on very basic questions of where different classes of society were allowed to be and when. And so through studying these individual houses, we really get a good sense of belonging, of where people felt they belonged in the city, and where people felt that enslaved people should belong, and where enslaved people themselves decided to belong. For instance, free white servants could be in places that slaves could not. Slaves could be in certain places that free white servants were not. For her part, Delphine, as the testimony shows, snuck into houses where she argued with white servants. She used fake passes to buy shoes and other goods. She hung out. She joked with and laid her hands on free white men in the shops. And she slept where she wanted to each night. Aimé Guillet had promised to free Delphine in his will, but his widow refused to make it legal, and so Delphine sued and lost in a ruling of the state Supreme Court that even at the time everyone recognized was a prohibition, should have been prohibited as an ex post facto ruling. The state legislature forbade all slave emancipations while this case was being heard, and so by the time it got to the Supreme Court decided that Delphine could not be free, even if the facts of her case were true, which they readily admitted they were. Now, Delphine's travels through the Faubourgs helped shine a light on resistance and anti-slavery. To see some of this anti-slavery and pro-slavery spatial imaginations at work, I also looked at a lot of images of the suburbs during these years. Here's a well-known one, Félix Achille de Beaupoil's view of a street in the Faubourg Marigny from the 1820s. I like this one because it shows the suburb developing and it shows kind of all the classes of people in the city. You have a man driving a dray over here on the left. I have a family of Native Americans walking towards the city. Father, mother, children. There's houses and cottages sprouting up in the background. It's a fashionable couple riding in their carriage. This is the Bernard Marigny plantation house right here. See a nice, well-dressed man standing on the corner. We also see an enslaved man and a child running towards the Faubourgs. Now, this man is wearing the blue and white striped pants that were worn by men who worked on the chain gang. And he's carrying a bottle of something, and they're running off into the Faubourgs. There's a different image of that same picture. The social latitude of free people of color, as we saw in the previous image, it worried some real estate developers, but it gave others a marketing tool. And so these rival geographies of real estate show how freedom practices and the pro-slavery ideology competed in the spatial imaginations of the Faubourgs, like in these plans from the notarial archives. Here's a row of cottages on Claiborne Avenue, and here we see a man and a woman. We don't know if they're free or enslaved, but they're on Claiborne Avenue, so it's part of the neighborhood where many free people of color own real estate. But over here we see a woman, a child chasing a butterfly, most likely an enslaved woman carrying the umbrella over the baby. Another one here. This one on Durbany Street between Kellerick and Columbus. See a man of color riding a horse, swinging what looks like, I don't know, this could be a bay leaf branch. Maybe somebody who's knows about plants could tell me. But I love this. There's roosters strutting in the streets. There's a dog running. This just screams to me anti-slavery spatial imagination, but at the same time, it could be read as a pro-slavery as well. Sort of the potential buyer would put themselves into the image. Here's another one that really shows that dichotomy well. This is a row of cottages on Esplanade Avenue, Rue Plochet. It's Marais Street these days. And there's Tremay Street. But if you look down here at the image, on the far right, we see some soldiers walking along, led by a pair of black drummers. And this is this geography of containment. These soldiers, this militia is here to maintain order. And who are they going to maintain order over? We have a woman of color sweeping the sidewalk, but we also have a white family right here, peeking out from their cottage. You see some young children playing in the streets. So we have both of these imaginations about urban development at play. Now, another place to view the spatial imagination is through looking at the public works. Now, the public works inflamed political passions in the decades before the Civil War, the 1820s to the 1850s. The colonial practice of these ad hoc public works going by project had become unworkable, and worse, were a hindrance to the modernizing city. To solve the problems of real estate and urban development, the city turned to new technologies like steam power and improved record keeping, while they refined older ones like the chain gang that we see here in another Felix Achille de Beaupoil image from Faubourg Sainte-Marie. You see these enslaved men wearing those white and blue striped pants. This woman with a halter around her neck is wearing the white and red striped dress that women were required to wear. But one central question that's central to the way I think about the public side of urban development is who built the city? I asked that question, and I was lucky to find records of the surveyors' offices that contain long lists of names of jobs and wages for hundreds of people who helped build the city. We know exactly who built the city in many of these cases. Now, in 1836, the city split into 3 separate municipalities, the famous and exciting municipality era, one of my favorite times. But then the Panic of 1837 caused a global financial depression not long after. In seeking to save money, the city government tried to make things more efficient, but they only made things worse for almost everyone except a small group of already wealthy families and individuals. This was government efficiency to benefit the rich at the top level of society. Now, New Orleanians saw the public works as a vital component for improving infrastructure, but the arguments of the municipal councils show that they also saw them as a valuable way to maintain a white racial and social order. And we see this in the makeup of the public works crews, both free and enslaved. The surveyors' departments, where the public works were all performed, they drew their workers from these waves of new immigrants as well as through the traditional mode of hiring enslaved laborers. In the colonial and early American period until about the middle of 1820s, public works employees were mostly free men and women of color, or slaves owned by the city, or enslaved people hired by private individuals. But this changing proportion of white and black laborers after the 1820s reflected a problem of supply. This is the same era that the population of the city is whitening after about 1840. There's forced migrations to enslaved people to the expanding plantations to grow sugar and cotton and tobacco, while European immigrants came to the city by the thousands. Now, on the public works, the experience suggests that white immigrant laborers probably had a little bit less economic and political liberty, because non-property holders were unable to vote until 1845, but they enjoyed much more stability in their work. Now, during the municipality era, each of these groups were thrust together on the different crews, and each municipality hired more and spent more on free white workers than they did on enslaved black workers. And it was Irish, it was Germans, it was Italians. It's folks who were struggling to make ends meet, but who also struggled to do more than become common laborers. There were a few folks, though, who were able to become middle managers and skilled laborers, and they achieved social stability through these jobs. And one of these jobs was overseer of the chain gang. We see a series of men become overseer of the chain gang, beginning in the 1790s and on through past the Civil War, who slowly built their way up through the ranks, saved money, bought property, built a house, all at the expense of these enslaved people. And here at the very bottom of the system, enslaved people found ways to survive and resist. Slave mastery proved exceptionally difficult on the public works, enslaved men and women who worked for the surveyor's office did resist in many ways, which is unique to the urban environment of New Orleans. Now, for these overseers and police and jailers, they were incentivized with monetary rewards to commit people to the work crews and punish them once they were in jail. This cheapness and government efficiency meant kidnapping people, free black sailors, and free people of color off the streets. So with impunity, New Orleans authorities seized people of color and committed them to labor on the chain gang and public works without any sort of legal process. But there were networks of people standing at the ready to help liberate and work on the legal side of things to free wrongfully imprisoned free people of color. And residents made more forceful interventions too. James Roper, a white man, attacked the overseer Adam R. Brunette, an overseer of the chain gang, when he was attacking Mary, one of the women under Brunette's charge. Roper justified his violence by reporting that he watched Brunette punch Mary so hard she fell to the ground, kick her until she was senseless, kick her even harder as she tried to rise, beat her with a broomstick while she lay prone in the gutter, and then whip her unmercifully. Roper was acquitted. James Gordon, a free man of color, was alleged to have committed a most violent and unprovoked assault and battery on the person of Leonard Kerrigan, another overseer of the chain gang. Now, Kerrigan was an overseer, and we know he was paid to inflict violence on enslaved people to increase productivity and efficiency. And Gordon, a free man of color, well, I wasn't able to find proof of this, very likely had relatives, could have had relatives on the chain gang or on the public works crews who he was avenging. So in wrapping this up, I've tried to show a broad range of my work and kind of go along the entire gamut of it. But I tried to show where these people, these groups of people, and these developments fall on the spectrum between pro-slavery and anti-slavery spatial imagination. But in the final analysis, it's difficult to argue that New Orleans was anything but a pro-slavery city. But to me, one of the great things about this work is that there was a greater degree of anti-slavery than is generally acknowledged. The strength of unionism in the city during the Civil War, which frankly, we don't talk about enough, there were thousands of Unionists in the city even before the Union Army took control in 1862. But to me, this is evidence that anti-slavery feeling in the city was stronger in earlier decades than generally accepted. And my work shows that. I think I also challenge this notion that everything about the built environment and architecture is tainted with slavery. It isn't. The slave power did not exert indisputable power over everything. And so I think it's important to keep that in mind. And ultimately, and I'm going to talk about this more in my next two talks, but the big thing that I take away from this is that the tools of resistance are built into the city itself. So that's the conclusion of my talk. I hope you've been entertained and I hope you've learned a lot, and I'd love to take some questions.
Perfect. Absolutely fantastic lecture, Greg.
Thanks very much.
The
I'm going to
detail.
stop my share.
What's that?
Then I'm going to stop my share.
Okay. The detail you showed tonight was really fascinating. It really reminded me a lot of the New Orleans architecture series kind of coming to life and seeing them and the zoom in. So very interesting.
Well, those books are a great inspiration to me. Absolutely. So I hope I built away from that, or
And
built
those are
on top of
those
that.
are the Friends of the Cabildo books on top of it.
Amen to that.
So I have a couple questions. If you have questions, please put them in the chat. I love to ask everyone else's questions as well, but I will kick it off. You mentioned when you were talking about the trade of the cotton trade and the sugar trade, you mentioned that there was also a byproduct of the sugar trade that was used in
Right.
New Orleans. What was that byproduct you talked about? And
Oh,
I'll follow up on that once I hear what it was.
sure. It was called bagasse,
Okay.
Bagasse. And maybe I'm pronouncing that incorrectly, but that's when the sugar's pressed into liquid to be granulated. The bagasse is sort of the leftover cane, and
Okay.
that material was used that was used to make rum. It was used in distilling processes.
Okay. It was the rum distilling process. Okay. So so then they would make so the rum wasn't always from the Caribbean that was sent as part of the the triangle. I guess it is somewhat of a triangle. That's what I mean, the Atlantic
Mhm.
Triangle. There was also a ton of rum being made in New Orleans as well because of the byproduct of this cane that was being used in the plantations.
That's right. That's right.
That's that's I did not know that. That's fascinating to hear. I know we had a large amount of rum distilleries in Louisiana, but now we have a big comeback, and but it's like
Yeah.
15. It's like 15, but it was like, it was a huge industry in Louisiana. So that's fascinating.
And it
That
wasn't just rum, it was all kinds of liquors too, because that
you
Fort
mentioned
Clement,
gin. That's right. You did mention
yeah,
gin. Yeah.
the Fort and Clement distillery in Faubourg, of course, they specifically when they sold it later, which they also
That's a French company.
yeah, Fort and Clement, I'm sure,
Yeah.
right? But they advertise themselves as a gin distillery
Okay.
specifically. So
All
long
right.
traditions with all the liquors in the city.
Yeah. Ellis asked, thank you. Please summarize your thoughts about how the tools of the resistance are built into the city.
Sure, great. I tried to have an intriguing conclusion because that's something I'm going to talk about in the next two lectures. But just briefly, it's the way that the public works crews were navigating the city while at work, but also taking care of their own social and family obligations. There are several stories about people who worked on the chain gangs who then escaped, and the advertisements always say they're probably not always, but in some of them that they're staying with relatives. And so to me, the way they were able to move about freely while on these gangs um, sort of shows that resistance was already present. And so they could, I'm struggling to enunciate it, but I think a better example might be to bring it further up. We have, I saw a great video, y'all just had Mardi Gras, and I was telling Jason I'm real jealous, but just videos of folks dancing on top of the bus stops. That to me sort of encapsulates in today's day and age, resistance built in to the city streets. It's just using the infrastructure of the city for your own ends.
Let's see what he had. Craig says, really interesting presentation, new ideas and concepts for my own education. Thank you. Okay, so I had my next question was, when you were talking about the city was very quick into subdividing the plantations. And they very quickly wanted buildings up and stuff like that. And you said that they convinced the ships to sell off the what's it, the board, what was
The
the board?
ballast.
Yeah.
Oh,
Oh,
the barge board.
the barge board, and they immediately took that and built buildings along the Badger. So my question is that like, was that the city like doing that, and they were like, are they actively doing it, or are they encouraging the public to buy this and build up buildings here and stuff like that? That was an interesting aspect that the city needed to get these buildings up.
All of the above. With these buildings, that a lot of times the flatboatmen would land on the Batcher and have no place to stay, so they would just either stay on the flatboat or they would drag it ashore and build little shacks on the Batcher.
Okay.
But after this sort of got out of hand, the city ordered that all the flatboats be broken up and all the lumber brought to specific locations. Um, uh, Jackson Square was one of them. Washington Square was for the Marigny, and Lafayette Square, which was just the Place d'Armes for Faubourg Saint Marie, was where that, or it was Place Gravier, I'm sorry. Gravier Square was where the boards were brought for that suburb. But then from those places, the city sold the boards to builders, they sold it to homeowners, but they also used it to build sidewalks and crossing bridges in the suburbs, because most of the stone ballast went straight to the Vieux Carré. And that was something that really ruffled feathers later on, is that all the good stone was used for sidewalks and curbs in the Vieux Carré, but it was just barge board that was being used to make the sidewalks and the crossing bridges in the suburbs.
Yeah. I don't know if you ever have you come across Ryan Gray at UNO in the
Yeah.
work he's done. I mean, has he come across in his archaeological work just offhand like these I mean, these would have been big ballast rocks, and they should not be where they are. And I'm sure he's gotten down there and probably seen some pretty heady stuff of stuff that should not be there.
I bet he has. I'm familiar with his work on the housing projects. His book that came out a few years ago, and I actually worked with Ryan on a history of 626 Bourbon Street, which is one that I did a house history of way back when,
Okay.
and then new owners brought him in to do some archaeological digging, and so we collaborated on that publication. But I'm not sure if they found any of these big ballasts or not. In my understanding, a lot of it in those days was just used to pave the streets
Okay.
and
It was just the
cobblestone
streets.
style.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Craig says, I've always used the term Belgian blocks for the street paving stones. Any clarification on this name? You mentioned they came from all over the world.
Yeah, so at a certain point, there's more uniformity in street pavement. And Richard Campanella actually goes into great detail on this in his
There was
Bourbon Street book.
actually actual street pavement in New Orleans back in the day, but now we're in the situation we are with street paves in this town now.
Well, well, there are many, many varieties of street pavement that were popularized for shorter or longer periods of time. But this initial role of street paving was done with ballast, and Belgian block does come along. That's when I think, in my understanding, is when the city had a little bit more money to spend at various points, and we're doing more work to import the actual stone to make things more orderly and more uniform.
Gotcha.
But yeah, the Belgian block's out there too. It's not one type of paving everywhere. It's a lot of different types that were put together.
Maybe we need to bring back Belgian blocks. Last question. You mentioned um, the Faubourgs, and that was an area you kind of focused on these great Faubourgs. What is the actual oldest building in New Orleans that's in the Faubourgs?
Wow, that's a really good question. I'm not sure I have a specific answer.
What is the oldest you can go? You could probably maybe think of off the top of your head, just as like it's pretty daggum old.
Yeah, I think I would have to say, and this is just a guess, but the oldest building that I've personally been involved with researching the history of was on Chippewa Street. And as far as I was able to tell, it's been there since the 1810s.
Wow.
It was a building that was on the plantation, the Delasize plantation, and from the way I've looked at it, it's right there. It's on a corner. I hesitate to throw it out there because I know the lady that lives there. I don't know if she wants folks gawking, but it's in Faubourg Delasize on Chippewa Street, and I think it was built in the 1810s.
Okay. Wow. One more question.
All right.
Cher says the Royal Frenchman Hotel claims to be Mariny's home. Well, is that true? Corner of Royal and Frenchman Streets.
No, that's not true.
But
Uh,
never let a
it-
good story get in the way.
that's right. That's right. Mariny's home was on Mandeville Street and Charter Street. That was where the front of the garden was, and the house was the block behind where the power plant is.
Gotcha. All right, Greg, we got next Tuesday, Rival Soundscapes of Civil War New Orleans, correct? I
That's
got that
correct.
fixed. And a little preview on that a little bit, just a sentence or two.
Sure. Well, I'm going to introduce this idea of rival soundscapes. that I kind of build from this idea of rival geographies, but I'm bringing it up to the brass band traditions and their explosion during the 1960s and 70s on Claiborne Avenue. And this is where we're really going to get into this notion of resistance being built into the urban environment. And so next week is going to be about the United States colored troops and the nascent civil rights movements and the role of sound and music in emancipation.
Perfect. Ellis is going to answer some more of your question as we're going to build.
Come on out.
Well, I hope everybody enjoyed it.
Yeah, let's hear from Catherine Cecil, who's one of my
let me respond to this
on the Claiborne Avenue History Project.
If you attended this lecture, will you receive the link to the next two? Yes, I will send them. Everybody will receive it as well as the recording, and you can watch it for 30 days. And then do you see Catherine's question?
Yeah. No, I think those absolutely count. Issue, Catherine, is that Bayou Road, it's not quite a Faubourg. It's kind of its own out of the city development. But I think there's room in my thinking to make it count. So yeah, I think there's something to be said about Bayou Road as this suburban landscape that's there before the Faubourgs. So maybe I need to do some more research. That's always good to know.
There you go. People giving you ideas to work on. That's always the best kind of ideas.
That's right. I love that. Yeah. Thanks, Catherine.
All right. Well, thank you so much, everybody. We will see you guys next week. Greg, great lecture. We look forward to next week. I mean, seeing the title, I did not expect us to go into the 1960s and brass bands. So I'm super excited.
Well, I'm going to talk about the brass bands in the next one. I'm going to
that's the next
week. But
okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's part and parcel.
Yeah, perfect. Well, we're looking forward to the next 2 weeks, and we'll see everybody next Tuesday at 6 p.m. And Greg, thank you so much.
Great to be here. Thanks, y'all.
Bye.